Climate change is a big concept, and it's an even larger problem. To understand it, first we have to step back and we have to consider some of its fundamental science and some of its fundamental economics. The prospects of global warming and the climate changes it produces come first from the basic science of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. First, they rise to the mid-atmosphere, and they remain intact there for about 100 years before decomposing. And the consequence of that is that they accumulate, because there's more rising every day, but they're sticking there for a century. Second, they absorb and then they refract the sun's infrared radiation. So that when solar radiation comes from the sun, strikes the Earth, and then much of it is reflected back into the atmosphere, and then from there into space, because we now have all these greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere, they absorb some of that radiation, and then they retransmit it in all directions so that some of it goes back and strikes the Earth again. So that some of the infrared radiation from the sun, which would normally go back into space, comes back to the Earth. And the higher these concentrations are in the atmosphere, the more infrared radiation is redirected back to our planet, gradually raising the temperature of everything that absorbs that radiation. And that's mainly land and water. In the last 100 years, these concentrations of greenhouse gases have risen from around 250 parts per million to around 370 parts per million if we only look at carbon dioxide. Climate scientists believe that our natural systems can remain reasonably stable, the climate, so long as these concentrations don't exceed 450 to 550 parts per million. Let me mention that CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. There are chlorofluorocarbons and there's methane. If we take their concentrations in the atmosphere and we do what's called converting them to CO2 equivalents, the actual concentrations today are not 370 parts per million, but 415 parts per million. So we're a lot closer to the threshold of climatic damage than is often normally understood. That's the basic science. At present rates, these concentrations will exceed the safe range of 450 to 550 in about 3 decades. They'll reach 750 parts per million by the end of this century, with potentially catastrophic effects for the global climate. The rest of the big picture is fundamentally economic. Climate has become, first of all, it really comes out of economics, the problem, in the sense that it's become a pressing problem and concern for 2 reasons. And the first is modern globalization. In 1990, and this is something that President Clinton used to think about a great deal, in 1990, 18% of everything produced in the world, I'm going to talk as an economist for a little while, was traded across borders. 18% of everything produced here and every other country then got traded. By 2006, 30% of everything, of worldwide GDP, was traded across borders. Moreover, this trade is different from kind of traditional trade, where advanced countries like us would buy commodities from developing countries, we'd bring them home, we'd make them into manufacturers, and then we'd sell them to ourselves or to other advanced countries. With globalization, what we've done is our corporations, using technological advances, have taken apart the manufacturing process, broken it up into hundreds of different parts, and then distributed the parts to countries around the world, wherever each part could be made most efficiently. The result of that is that we have transferred whole new modern business organizations to developing countries, to China and to India and to Indonesia, Malaysia and Nigeria and the transition economies in Eastern Europe and Argentina and Brazil. And the result of that is the fastest wave of modernization across the developing world we've ever seen, especially in China, but also in all those other countries, in Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, a country that will be one of the world's largest countries in 15 years, Romania, Ghana, Brazil, Mexico. And with the rising incomes that accompany this kind of modernization, these developing nations have become big markets for everything that's produced through this global process. The issue in all of this for us today is that modernization itself and the fast-growing markets for its products is very energy intensive. Worldwide energy demand increased more than 25% over the last 10 years, and the most recent forecasts see a further increase in worldwide energy demand going up 35% over the next 10 years. And most of that is coming from the developing world. The use of energy is expected to jump 80% in China and India and the rest of developing Asia. By 2020, developing countries will consume half of all the worldwide oil production, 55% of all natural gas, and nearly 70% of the global use of coal. All of this new energy demand from the developing world reflects not only the fact they're growing fast, but also that developing economies are much more energy intensive than advanced economies. China, India, everybody else in the developing world, their economies are focused almost exclusively on manufacturing and agriculture, two things which are very energy intensive. And moreover, their manufacturing and farming operations are also relatively less energy efficient than ours are. Our economy is focused on services. Two-thirds of our economy, more than two-thirds of our economy is services. These are economies in which two-thirds or more are manufacturing and agriculture. So they're not only growing very fast, they are also growing through in very energy intensive ways. And the final critical part of this problem is that coal is currently the world's most plentiful and most inexpensive, consequently most inexpensive energy source, especially for generating the electricity that powers almost every economy in the world. And it is also the most carbon intensive and therefore climate destructive energy source out there. It's a coincidence, the fact that it's cheap and carbon intensive. They're not related. It's cheap because there's so much of it. It's carbon intensive because that's what coal is. We naturally have moved to enormous uses of coal because it's cheap. And it is also the primary source of energy across the developing world, again, because it's plentiful. China's got huge coal reserves. We've got huge coal reserves. Russia's got huge coal reserves. Coal is almost everywhere. Oil, much less so. The ability to use nuclear power, much, much less so. The ability to use solar, wind power, much, much less so. So this is, the problem of climate change comes out of the convergence of big forces that happen to be the way the world developed. And you put all together all these factors, and without steps that, yes, will involve significant costs, and especially for the countries at the core, at the heart of modernization and globalization, which are the United States and China. We are the two poles of the global economy. We're the fulcrums. Without massive changes in both the United States and in China, and then in many, many other countries around the world, our children and grandchildren will live in a period of very nasty, very economically and socially disruptive climate changes, the kinds of climate changes that will force the migration of hundreds of millions of people from coastal cities and the loss of coastal cities around the world. The kind of changes that will destroy current agricultural regions and create new agriculture regions where we aren't prepared to take advantage of them. To avoid this scenario, we have to figure out in the next few years how to keep greenhouse gas emissions below their current levels, even as worldwide energy use rises sharply, and then to sharply reduce them further. The challenge is part technological. since achieving the goal requires the development and spread of both more energy-efficient equipment and materials and alternative fuels. And at 450 parts per million, what the technologies we have won't do the job. We're too close to the problem. The challenge is also economic, since every plausible response involves higher energy prices, which will take a little piece out of growth. And it's deeply political as well, since politicians are very reluctant to ask voters to pay higher prices for anything, much less to head off some larger cost in the future. So that solving climate change is one of the most daunting political problems of this period. It's also geopolitical, because the United States cannot do this alone. Europe cannot do this alone. Given the trajectory of energy consumption and the particular fuels that are being used, no matter what the United States, Europe, and Japan did, it would not be enough. We must be joined by the large developing countries who very soon will account for more than half of all new greenhouse gas emissions. Must be joined in particular by China and India and Brazil and Mexico and Indonesia and Malaysia and Bangladesh and Nigeria and Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Now, given these hurdles, it may seem kind of pretty daunting. But, you know, the prospects for the World Trade Organization look pretty impossible, and President Clinton managed to achieve that, because it gained momentum with U.S. and European leadership and a growing recognition that its costs, if done right, could be less than feared. American leadership on climate is just emerging. We had leadership in the 1990s. The president and the vice president led the effort to write the Kyoto Accords. We lost the leadership. We had an administration that had no interest in the issue. But it has become a priority again, both for the Obama administration and for the Democratic Congress. I think some help in this can come from growing evidence that an effort with reasonable adjustment costs can succeed. That the worst case scenarios of what it's going to cost are not necessary. They will be necessary if we don't take steps for the next 20 years. But we can take steps today that will keep these costs reasonable. A 2007 study, for example, analyzed all the options if everyone agreed, all countries agreed to constrain their greenhouse gas emissions, and found that we could achieve these goals through a lot of changes which, in fact, while they cost something in the short term, save money in the long term. We all know this from our own lives. We know that halogen light bulbs cost more to buy, but over their lifetime, they use so much less energy that they actually save us money in the end. So a good part of the effort is going to involve improving energy efficiency in ways that over time don't cost people anything. Shifting to hybrid automobiles, improving the insulation in buildings, plants, and homes, and using more energy-efficient heating and lighting systems generate savings through the reduced energy use that all offset their initial costs. By one estimate, better insulation and more efficient heating, cooling, and lighting alone could reduce the growth of worldwide electricity demand by half over 20 years. So those are regulatory steps we can take, if everyone adopted it, of course. The next least expensive steps involve planting more forests and slowing deforestation, because vegetation absorbs CO2 and produces oxygen, so the more the better. And changes in livestock practices. These are the contributions that a lot of developing countries can make, in particular, where the deforestation problem is greatest and where agricultural practices can best be changed. So this suggests that progress could be less painful than many people assume, and that's true, but only with a genuine worldwide effort. And this will still be a hard sell, particularly in developing countries, since it costs more initially to use cleaner and more energy-efficient technologies, and developing countries don't have the more to spend on it. So eventually we may find that in order to enlist China and India in this effort. We either need to create a fund in order to help support those transformations, or my own preference is, instead of a fund, I say we create hundreds of joint ventures between American companies and Chinese companies that together develop the new energy efficient technologies in the alternative fuels, bring them into the commercial process. That's what a country like China wants. And then we both share in it. Same thing is true in India. Indian companies could develop the software for these technologies. So there are a lot of different ways of approaching this. But the basic problem remains, for our own policy, of how we go about changing the behavior of our households, how we get American households and American businesses to positively prefer to use energy sources which are less carbon intensive as compared to more carbon intensive, and to positively prefer to use technologies which are less energy intensive than those which are more energy intensive. And the answer that everyone who looks at climate change has, no matter what their approach, is we have to change the relative prices of energy based on their carbon content. In effect, we have to say the more carbon intensive the source of energy, the higher the price of the energy. That we change all the price signals so that people save by using less carbon intensive forms of energy and pay more by using more carbon intensive sources of energy, and in particular that businesses know that they can save by using more energy efficient and less carbon intensive technologies, that they can save if their heating and insulation and cooling systems are less carbon intensive and more energy efficient, and that they can make money by developing new technologies and new energy sources that are less carbon intensive and more efficient. So we need to change those relative prices. Well, people have looked at what is the price you would have to get to in order to move behavior. Economists talk about elasticity of price and elasticity of demand, and that means what's the point at which you say, too much, I'm going to shift to that, or too much, I'm going to use less of that. And, you know, there's a lot of data on that. We put it into charts and models and we figure it out. And it looks like the average cost of all the measures needed to keep greenhouse gas concentrations 20 and 30 years out within what we think is a safe range would be a charge of $50 per ton of CO2 produced. That's equal to $185 per ton of carbon. So to put that in perspective, it's pretty abstract in that form. It's substantial, but it's not back-breaking. At current rates of energy use, it means it would cost about $1,500 per year per American household. About half that for European households, because they're much more energy efficient than we are, because they have very high energy taxes. To move behavior sufficiently by businesses and individuals and create the incentives to develop these new technologies and new fuels so that we could stay with it, so that we can preserve the climate. The catch is that nobody wants to pay anything today that's more than they have to pay, including for a hybrid car or a very energy efficient washing machine, to head off some larger costs in the future. Now, the easiest way to overcome this resistance from some people's perspective would be a government mandate and regulations. And frankly, in some areas, that's where we're headed. You know, we have mandates for energy efficiency in automobiles, the CAFE standards, higher energy efficiency standards for appliances. They're voluntary now. They'll be mandatory within a couple of years. The regulations will cost consumers and businesses more at first and save some in the long run. But the truth is, this kind of regulation can only get a small piece of the job done, and then only if everyone in the world did it. And that's not happening. So if we're going to seriously engage in this problem over the next decade, there are two big alternatives out there. One is what's called a cap-and-trade regime, such as Kyoto, and the other is new carbon-based taxes. And both approaches have the same basic theory, which is we have to make it more expensive to use carbon-intensive forms of energy and relatively less expensive to use less carbon-intensive forms of energy. We're changing energy prices. Under cap-and-trade, we would agree to cap our greenhouse gas emissions at a particular level, and then we allocate the right to produce those emissions in permits that we distribute to the major greenhouse gas producers. It means utilities, manufacturers, agribusinesses, oil and gas producers, and distributors, based on some fraction of the estimated emissions from some previous year. Those who come under their caps at relatively low cost would do so and sell any excess permits they had to those who couldn't meet their caps at such a cheap price. Those who make changes to come under their permits, the caps, will pass those costs on to you and me and to other customers. So will those who have to buy more permits, and in that way, the more permits you have to buy, the higher the price for the energy or the use of the energy that's carbon intensive. A lot of politicians here and in Europe who want to address greenhouse gas emissions have favored cap and trade. In fact, the president is technically, formally supports cap and trade, and the Kyoto Agreement negotiated by the Clinton administration is a cap and trade agreement. And it's not hard to see why. The inevitable price increases look like they come from the market at first. More disturbing, frankly, the record of Kyoto says it can be very easy to game the process of setting the caps, so little sacrifice is required of anyone. Most economists don't like cap and trade. Probably 80% of economists say you got to go with carbon-based taxes, and I want to explain why. Economists see that any system of preset caps will make energy prices more volatile than they are already. Let me explain why. You set a cap of emissions that assumes a certain energy use, and then the winter is colder than you expected when you set the cap, or the summer is hotter than you expected, or the economy grows a little faster than you expected. And when any of those things happen, demand for energy goes up. And as it goes up, but you set the cap assuming that the winter wasn't going to be so cold or the summer wasn't going to be so hot, and you've distributed all these permits. But you've got this cap, and as demand begins to hit up against the cap, the price goes way up. The price of those permits and the price of the underlying energy. We know this is the way it happens because we've seen cap and trade systems in practice. We use cap and trade to control sulfur dioxide emissions, which produce acid rain. And the price of the permits to produce SO2 have moved up or down by an average of 17% a month over the last 15 years. The Europeans are using a cap and trade program, which is not reducing emissions, but it's still cap and trade, in what's called the European Trading Scheme, and the price of their permits has moved up or down 20% per month on average in its first 3 years. And this is built into any regime that says we're going to regulate something by setting a cap. As soon as demand hits up against the cap, the price soars. Or if demand is much lower than you expected, the price falls very sharply. The problem with rising prices is that nobody wants to pay them. The problem with falling prices is that if you don't know what the price of carbon is going to be, how do you figure out whether it makes sense to invest in a new insulation system for your house or a hybrid car? if you don't know what the price of the gasoline or the energy is going to be because it's so volatile? More to the point, how does a business know whether it's going to make money off of developing a new technology to reduce carbon emissions if it doesn't know what the price of carbon is going to be? And the fact is that under a cap and trade regime, you can never know. The other problem with cap and trade, that's the problem with the cap. Then there's the problem with the trade. And that is, we have just come through a period, we haven't come through it, we're in the middle of it, in which we have had the meltdown of our financial system and enormous economic costs, the deepest recession in 80 years, not only here but worldwide, because of the distortions caused from the purchase and trading of securities based on an asset, housing, whose prices were very volatile and nobody could predict, and then crashed. And we derivatized these and credit default swaps and options, et cetera. Well, what cap and trade proposes to do is to create a new $1 trillion in financial assets, which we know will be volatile because all cap and trade regimes produce volatility in the prices, which we know will be the focus of speculators because speculation depends on volatility in prices. That's how speculators make money. That we know will be subject to insider trading because, as an executive of a very large oil company pointed out to me, energy companies and utilities will see shifts in demand for energy coming before anybody else does in the market, so they can inside trade. Enron was a great fan of cap and trade, incidentally. True. They had a big trading operation. And which we know will produce all the kinds of complex derivatives that we saw with mortgage-backed securities. These are just energy-backed, emission-backed securities, rather. The idea that when we have demonstrated our incapacity to manage these markets, these kinds of markets, that we would then create a new one, and instead of putting housing at the basis of it, we would put the entire energy system of the United States at the basis of it, is reckless. It's simply reckless. It's also unnecessary because there is an alternative. And environmental economists and macroeconomists like myself have always said, wait a minute, you don't want a quantity-based regime. You want what we call a price-based regime because that sets a clear price for carbon through a tax, because that gives a clear and direct price signal to everybody to favor less carbon-intensive fuels and less energy-intensive technologies. It doesn't make prices more volatile when demand rises unexpectedly or falls unexpectedly. They also can reduce the use of, we know they reduce the use of carbon-intensive forms of energy because that's what's happened in the high utility and gasoline taxes in much of Europe, which has made their businesses and households much more energy efficient than in the United States. Now those taxes are not, they're just specific to energy. They're not specific to carbon. We're taking this one step further and making them not just keyed to how much energy you use, but how much carbon is in the energy, because the problem here is the carbon. And everybody agrees that a carbon-based tax system would be much simpler to administer than the permits under cap and trade and less open to disruptions to the economy. The shortcoming is that carbon taxes allow, one shortcoming, there are two big ones, allow emissions to increase with unexpected demand, as happens today. The only advantage of cap and trade is that it actually caps emissions. That's the environmental advantage. But the fact is that we don't need a cap. We can have what I call a hard goal, where we say, look, this is the path of emissions we need to be on. So this is our goal in every year. And if we fall short because the winter was very cold and people used a lot more energy, then we have an adjustment mechanism in the tax rate. Over every 2 to 3 years, the rate moves up or down to keep us on the path of emissions that we need to be on. The other The other real disadvantage or shortcoming of a carbon tax is that it's a tax. That's a shortcoming economically, it's a shortcoming socially, and it's a shortcoming politically. Let's recognize first, however, that however we do this, we will have the effect of a tax. Cap and trade, to get on the same emissions path as a carbon-based tax, that is the same emission reduction, cap and trade raises the price of energy just as much as a carbon-based tax. It just does it in a much more volatile way. The same thing is true of regulation. You're going to increase the cost. The regulation increases the cost to businesses of using carbon-based fuels, and they pass it along in higher prices. So the effect is the same. They're all using this price signal. The advantage of a carbon-based tax is that, with respect to this, is that it's very simple to undo a lot of those problems by recycling the revenues. The government will take in my models where the size of the tax required to put us on a decent path, an acceptable path, takes in about $200 billion a year. It used to sound like a lot of money, I have to say. It doesn't sound like as much money today as it used to. 200 maybe is $250 billion a year. We can recycle all of those revenues in payments back to households. The point here is not to make people poorer. The point here is not even to get people mainly to use less energy. It's mainly to get them to use less carbon. And, to the extent that we could, if we could shift to an entirely wind and solar energy structure, which we can't, but if we could, who would care about the use of how much energy we use? It's not the energy, it's the carbon. Or the geostrategic dependence the energy places us in because we don't own the energy. We have to buy it from corrupt regimes and dangerous regimes around the world. So the fact is that we can insulate everyone from the direct costs of this. We're not trying to make people poorer. We're trying to change the relative prices of energy based on the damage they do to the environment. And we can do that by recycling the revenues, taking in these revenues and recycling them. In my own preference, I would only recycle 90% of the revenues. I would keep 10% and use it for to support climate-friendly R&D, and also as subsidies for people and households who need to make the transition to more energy-efficient and climate-friendly technologies. We're going to have to redo the entire electricity grid in this country. No matter what we do, we're going to have to do that, to take lots of new alternative forms of energy. That costs a lot of money. We're going to expect businesses to move to entirely new technologies and forms of energy. That's going to take a lot of money. We're going to expect households to do the same over a period of 20 to 30 years. This is a gradual thing. A piece of that money should be used to help defray some of those costs. So I would recycle 90% and use the other 10%. I like direct payments to households. You have to adjust for geography. There are a lot of geographic differences here, not only in energy use, but in the kind of energy. Some people live in areas where most of the power is nuclear. That's relatively clean in this context. Others are dependent on coal. That's the dirtiest possible. So their prices are going to go up a lot more. So you have to make geographic adjustments. You've got to make lots of adjustments. Look, this is a hard and complex problem, and it's going to take hard and complex solutions. The only reason we're doing it is because we have no choice. This is not a discretionary policy. This is not something anyone would choose to do other than the fact that we have to do it. I think that serious action on climate change will probably occur over the next 2 to 3 years in the United States. My own guess is, and I'm not so good at this kind of political guessing. These guys are better than I am at this. But my guess is that we're talking probably 2011 when we actually engage and pass something in the Congress. I think this year is the economy and next year is healthcare, and then we get to climate. But we need to have a clear and open debate. We need to move into this with everybody's eyes wide open about what the consequences are, the economic and social consequences of both cap and trade and carbon-based taxes. These are going to be the two major alternatives. Look, among that, for families with incomes of less than $10,000, 50% of their discretionary income goes to energy. Families with incomes under $30,000, 30% of their post-tax discretionary income goes to energy to run for their houses and their cars. And, we cannot put in place a policy that doesn't protect those people. We cannot make large parts of the American population, push them into dire poverty as part of protecting the environment. It's our responsibility to figure out a way to address not only the environment, but the social and economic consequences as well. That's what the Clinton approach to government was all about, frankly. So it's very appropriate to be talking about it here. And I'll tell you, this proposal of this $50 per ton of CO2 with revenue recycling, I rented what's called the National Energy Modeling System. It's the model that the Energy Department uses to project energy and financial markets, and we ran it through the model. We found the model said it reduced emissions as much as the most prominent cap and trade proposals last year, which was much stricter than the new one that just came out from Waxman and Markey, which has so many offsets to get support that, according to the Sierra Club, it will not reduce emissions at all between now and 2020. This is the problem with how easy it is to game these complex proposals, and another reason why we need a very transparent program that everyone can understand, which is what a carbon-based tax does. Because it's a tax shift and not a tax hike, we found that this system, the model said, it did not produce any direct negative effects on the economy. The GDP projected in 2030, for example, was $22.3 trillion under this program, that's in 2005 dollars, compared to $22.5 trillion if we did nothing at all. So that says that, according to this model at least, the overall size of the economy, we can address climate change and reduce the overall size of the economy by $200 billion out of $23 trillion. That's a trivial cost. That's a rounding error, as they say in Washington. Moreover, I think these costs could be substantially less because the large resources dedicated to energy and climate-related R&D, with the incentives that the tax produces in itself for companies to develop new technologies and fuels, could produce technological advances and breakthroughs that would provide new ways of limiting emissions at less cost. It could. We can't depend on that. We can't wait 20 years and see if that happens, but I think that that's reasonable possibility. Look, in politics, nobody knows how events are going to unfold. We do know that climate change is on the agenda of the President and the Congress. The decisions they take are going to affect every one of us, and including America's global companies. There is in my judgment, there is no sound business alternative, no sound socially responsible alternative, certainly, but to engage seriously in this debate and to make sure that we pursue the most effective and efficient and socially responsive response to climate change available. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. We've got time for some questions. We've got a question right over here, Joy.
Okay. In addition to my job here, I also have timber interests about 40 miles north of here, and I've been doing a lot of research into carbon capture. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the future of that would be for people who are in the timber industry, or in terms of, you mentioned a little bit to it, but do you think it would be good for people to get into that?
Look, I think that if we take this kind of big approach to climate, whatever approach we take, we're going to create, the whole point is to create these incentives for people to change and for businesses to invest more in this area. I think that this will be a central part of the kind of the generation of growth in the economy, because this is where the innovation will be, and it's innovation that changes growth rates in economies. So yes, and not only that, it's not just a U.S. market. These things are global markets. So yes, I think that if we do it, look, let's not forget how hard it is, how hard it's going to be to do anything. People strongly resist assuming short-term costs in order to avoid larger long-term costs. We have almost no example of that ever happening. It's hard enough to get people to accept short-term costs for a long-term benefit, like Social Security. Getting people to take short-term costs to avoid a larger long-term cost requires enormous political leadership and a lot of clever ways to reduce those costs. That is the principal political reason why I favor a tax shift rather than simply a tax. Because I don't think that a tax, look, a tax, there are lots of things we could do with the tax money, but climate is more important than any of the things we could do with that tax money, and the only way to get this accepted is to return the funds, so let's do it.
Got a question in the back right there, Joy.
Yeah, hi, my name is Kevin Tran. Several weeks ago, a speaker from ConocoPhillips came here and expressed that the current administration might regulate in a way that's make it harder for an energy company to operate. What you're proposing is a carbon-based tax. How would that affect the current company that's producing coal right now during the transition period that might impact the economy?
Right. Look, there are two things. One is any tax, like any cap-and-trade regime, would phase in. So the initial costs are going to be a lot less than, you phase it in probably over 10 years before the full costs are supported. We're not talking about the elimination of coal. We are talking about, by all the models, the role of coal in energy would fall by about half. If we could get clean coal technology that actually worked, we wouldn't have to do that. But we don't. And I am told it's not within sight, it's not within reach, it's decades off. I hope I'm wrong, but we can't wait decades. We wait decades and the steps we would have to take will be profoundly draconian. So they're going to have to be, look, we're talking about a huge change in one of the fundamental factors of our lives and the economy. And again, we're only contemplating this because we have to, because we think the science says we have no choice. You know, nobody would take chemotherapy if they didn't have cancer. And so we're going to have transitions for coal companies. We're going to have transitions for coal-based communities. We're going to have to bring them along just like we're going to have to bring China along. I think it's very similar, frankly. China says, look, why should we absorb these costs? We're in a developing stage of our economy is fast developing. You wouldn't have accepted this in the 19th century, and they'd be right. So we have to reduce the cost for them, just like we're reducing the cost by tax recycling for households. We're going to have to do that for coal communities and coal companies too.
It seems to me that bringing China along is a part of the dilemma for a tax-based carbon approach, because you could do that for the United States given a series of things. But unless the rest of the world does the same, then you're in real problem. And so I'm wondering if it might be better to go ahead and go with a cap and trade approach, and then subsequently, which inevitably will be global, and then subsequently begin to change to a tax-based approach.
The geopolitical problem is greater than the domestic political problem. I agree with you. China has said explicitly she will never accept a cap. Has said so repeatedly. India has said that as well. Their objection is not to a particular tax, but to anything that they think will constrain their energy use. And in particular, China has enormous coal reserves. She's building an average of 1 coal-fired electricity plant per day because she's growing so fast. So it's not a particular objection to the tax, to a tax. They are more particularly object to the cap and trade, to the cap. Unless they got so many offsets and that they, in fact, didn't have to reduce their emissions at all. Or it's not just reduced, they didn't have to stop the increase, the sharp increases in their emissions, which they're actually carrying out. My view is that I don't think we're going to get the world to accept any single regime, whether it's a tax or cap and trade. I think the idea that, you know, that 180 incredibly diverse societies and political systems are going to accept one particular way of addressing this large and critical problem for everybody is fanciful. We haven't gotten the world to agree on anything else, except to talk about various things. But what we can accomplish with a lot of U.S. leadership, frankly, and some leadership from other countries, is to get everybody, each country, to agree to a path of reduction in their emissions. And then we say to every country, you achieve it however you choose. Some countries, including China, will probably do it largely through regulation, not through cap and trade or a tax. I think a tax could be attractive to China because she needs revenues to drive the modernization of her infrastructure, to drive the provision of health care and pensions for the 80% of Chinese who don't have either today. She needs revenues. So a tax may be attractive or not. I don't want to tell China how to do this. I don't want to tell anybody else how to do this. I just want them to do it. And however they choose to do it is fine with me and ought to be fine with anyone who cares about climate change. It's when you try to constrain that many countries or, constrain a country that sees herself quite properly as becoming, a great player in world history, it doesn't end up, you don't end up getting what you'd hope for.
Questions? Right here.
First of all, thank you very much. Constance Neely, and apologize for my voice. 2 quick comments. I certainly hope that we have the opportunity on the way to Copenhagen to uplift agriculture. You mentioned land, you mentioned livestock, but I think that we really need to take a full greenhouse accounting, and where we're putting in sustainable management practices, we've got enormous potential to sequester carbon in the soil. And this is going to make huge co-benefits for people in other countries so that they can actually survive and adapt to the climate change that's coming to them. And secondly, I'm not an economist, but I recently heard that in the UK, they're undergoing a sort of participatory exercise on these mitigation abatement cost curves. And I think this means the most bang for the buck for the technology that you're prepared to put in place. Anyway, I just wanted to put those 2 out there.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I think, look, the way we solve everything that we do manage to solve, is to get as many creative and smart people to think about it as possible in lots of different kinds of organizations. And, I approach this as a macroeconomist from 30,000 feet. I want the big principles to be right. But beyond those principles, there are a million different other things that have to be figured out. And that is what free societies are really good at. If you provide the incentives. England, the British have shown a lot of intellectual leadership in climate. They tried to figure out how to create a kind of not only individual carbon footprints for each person, but in effect nudge people, not require people, nudge in the current popular term, to respect a certain carbon allocation per person, that your lifestyle ought to, you ought to aim to consume energy and goods that have a particular level of carbon and not above that. They got lots of creative things out there.
We have time for one more question. I think it's right over here. Yes.
Back to the science. How do you respond to people who say that this current warming trend is simply a normal cycling of the climate and that it's really not a big deal?
The issue of, there are two different issues here scientifically. One is the kind of warming that all of us think about, which is what's the temperature? How hot does it get in summer and how hot does it get in winter? And those are subject to long and short cycles that overlap, and they are quite natural. But there is no debate about the physics of the molecules of greenhouse gases or about how they behave in the atmosphere in refracting infrared radiation, or the temperature of certain areas where, in particular water, where we have a fairly long record of it. And certainly no doubt about, no scientific question about the level of concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere. Now, a lot of this is based on models about what will happen in the future. That's because models are better than simply guessing about what happens in the future. Natural processes we can project with some confidence, not absolute confidence. You can't project what humans are going to do with any confidence. You can't project what societies are going to do, but you can project what molecules are going to do. So the kind of fundamental science is really not up for debate. There is a lot of question. Nobody knows whether these effects will be more or less than we expect in 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years, or 50 years. We don't know the pace at which this is developing, because climatic systems are simply too complex to model well enough to have any confidence about the exact date. Nor do we know, the exact distribution of the climatic changes. That is, will Florida be a savanna, which is one current projection by a major oil company, for example. Will that happen in 30 years or 80 years? We don't know that. We do know that if we wait to find out, it'll be too late to prevent it. And even, there's a debate about, is this all from human use or natural, et cetera. I don't know whether the rising concentrations, what percentage of it has come from natural processes and what percentage comes from human economic activity. I do know, but I don't need to know that. The only thing I need to know is, can changes in human activity change that trajectory? And that we know we can. That if we know how much emissions we're producing, and that if we reduce those emissions very sharply, we can change certainly the pace, the rate at which those concentrations are rising in the atmosphere, and hopefully stabilize them. Hopefully. A lot of this is giving us the breathing room and the incentives to develop the kinds of energy sources and technologies 50 years from now which we can't even imagine today. certain progress in nanotechnology, for example, if it works, we don't know, if it works, could make solar a predominant form of energy for the economy in 30 years. If it doesn't work, it won't. We don't know. We're buying the room to see which of those develop positively without waiting and to the point where, since we can never predict the pace of technological advance, we thought we would cure cancer a long time ago, and we didn't. To make sure that the climate is, that the world is climate friendly to human beings in our grandchildren's generation and the generation of their children.
Let's give a round of applause to Rob Shapiro.